Or do you want to stand here so you can do the mic?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Just watch the cord.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our program. I'm very excited to see the good crowd here. First up is our next program is going to be Wednesday, November 15th at 6:30. This will be the third Wednesday as opposed to the fourth Wednesday because of Thanksgiving. It's going to be 10 Treasures of the Cumberland Historical Society. It's going to be presented by Carolyn Small, which most of you know. I'd like to take a moment here to thank Carol Strattard in the back here for all her wonderful baked goods. She works very hard for us. And if you haven't tried any of her goodies, I recommend that you do before you leave. Next up, Cumberland Historical Society annual meeting is tomorrow night at the Historical Society. This meeting is actually the one where we're going to elect the new officers. If you have not voted yet and you'd like to vote, but you won't be there tomorrow, we do have ballot forms on the table over here to my left. If you're interested in voting, we'll make sure that that gets to them tomorrow night. And then last but not least, I'd like to introduce you to Master Naturalist and University of Southern Maine professor, Cheryl Laz. She will help us understand why there are so many stones and stone walls in Maine and what those walls and surrounding terrain can tell us. So, welcome.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to Linda and the Cumberland Historical Society for the invitation. I'm repeatedly and pleasantly surprised by how many people are interested in stone walls. I did not grow up in Maine. I did not grow up in a place where there were lots of stone walls. And I've been here over 30 years now and have always, for a long time, sort of just stumbled over them, encountered them in the woods, and why are people building walls in the middle of the woods? It really wasn't until more recently that I sort of started unpacking that question. And I started getting interested in stone walls as part of the Maine Master Naturalist program that I did in 2016. And if you don't know what the Maine Master Naturalist program is, it's a year-long intensive course that trains people to understand and interpret Maine's natural history and to prepare them to teach other people, to present nature education to other people. And as part of that program, I had to do a culminating project, and I decided to focus on stone walls. And I did that for two reasons. For one, it enabled me to really pull together all of the threads of and topics that we had addressed in that course. So I got to dig a little deeper into geology and mammals and ferns and lichens and natural communities. So I got to pull together a lot of different topics. But it also was interesting to me because stone walls really are situated at the intersection of human history and natural history. And so for tonight, my presentation will really combine those two things, and I sort of alternate between human history and natural history. And what I aim to do tonight is to share some of what I've learned with you and to maybe spark some of your curiosity about stone walls. I should pause to say I'm a professor at USM, so I'm used to large groups of people, and I'm used to getting interrupted when I talk with questions and comments. And I think there will be a question and answer period at the end. I think I'll leave plenty of time for that. But if you have questions or comments or things to contribute while I'm talking, please just flag me down and we'll pause. I don't have any objections or concerns about that. Stone walls are probably familiar to all of us. Maybe, like me, you stumbled across them in the woods and as you've been out wandering. Maybe they're on the edges of your yard, right, or in your neighborhood. Is that true for some of you? And even if you've not encountered them walking or in your own yards, even just driving around in Maine, in rural or suburban areas, you often see stone walls, right, along the sides of roads or angling off into the woods or into fields. So stone walls are probably familiar to all of us, particularly if you're from Maine or spent a lot of time in Maine or really anywhere in New England, because really, New England is where the stone walls are at. In 1939, there was an estimate that there were 246,000 miles of stone walls in the United States. 246,000 miles. 240 of them were in New England. So the rest of the country doesn't have the same sort of quantity of stone walls that we do. So New England is really where the stones are. The story begins really millions of years ago with the formation of rock and continents and long periods of glaciation and interglaciation. And the advance and retreat of glaciers is really what shaped the New England landscape. Over millions of years, glaciers really pressed the land down and really several hundred feet down from what we know today. One indicator of that is some years ago I was up on Williams Mountain up near Jackman, and I found fossils of sea creatures, 1,200 feet up Williams Mountain, that used to be underwater, right, as a consequence of the weight of the glaciers. After the glaciers melted, right, there were still ice sheets that really shaped the land, including some of the features that you might be familiar with pictured here, which is the mountains in Jordan Pond in Acadia National Park, right? All of that sculpted by glacial erosion. The most recent glacial episode in Maine was from about 35,000 years ago to about 11,500 years ago. And it was called the Laurentide Ice Sheet. And you can see from this map sort of the size and scale of the Laurentide Ice Sheet. It was roughly 4,000 miles in diameter and covered most of northern North America, all of Canada, and down through New England. So it was big. And not only big as in wide, but big as in deep. At its peak, about 21,000 years ago, before that glacier started receding, it was about 2 miles in depth. And this picture shows the one on the far side here where it says Montreal, shows roughly a 2 mile thick, right, blue ice sheet, right? And in scale are the skylines of some cities today, so Toronto, Chicago, Boston, and Montreal, right? So imagine a sheet of ice 2 miles thick, right, over all of New England. Right. Glaciers aren't just big ice cubes. They're ice, for sure, but they're not stable like an ice cube is. In fact, glaciers are unstable. They have sort of a brittle exterior, but inside maybe that 2 mile thickness, right, the ice is kind of soft and mushy, right? And so glaciers are sort of constantly unstable, sort of always seeking equilibrium, but never quite there. It doesn't mean they move fast, but they're always moving. And how fast they move, how they move, depends on a whole lot of different things. Sometimes underneath the glacier, there's basal meltwater, so it's like floating a little bit, it moves a little bit faster. If it encounters terrain that's really rocky or mountainous, that will slow down the movement of the glacier. But the ice sheet was always moving. Sometimes it kind of paused for thousands of years and just sort of jiggled a little bit back and forth, right? It didn't move a whole lot forward. It didn't move a whole lot back. It was stable-ish, but not really stable. It wasn't not moving. The ice sheet kind of stops at the point where the melting sort of catches up with the southern movement of it, and stayed there for thousands of years. And even as it did that, inside that mushy middle part was still moving. And we can see evidence of that movement in various places in Maine. This is a picture of a granite ledge in Westbrook, and you can see the striations or the grooves in that rock. And that also, it's actually oriented more or less accurately. The glacier moved from sort of the northwest to the southeast, right? And you can see that on the rocks. The glacier left behind thus sort of indicators like this. It also left behind what's called glacial till. And glacial till is sort of a soup, a big mix of rocks and stone that was pulverized by the movement of the ice sheet. You can't really see it in this picture, but on the bottom is what's called lodgement till. And it's generally pretty big boulders that are pretty rounded. Why? Because they were under the weight of a 2-mile thick piece of ice, and they were sort of moved along and tumbled, right? And all of that movement and that tumbling really rounded those boulders. That's in the bottom layer called lodgement till. The upper layer of what was left behind is this. It's called ablation till, and it's sort of a thinner, rocky, sandy, sort of looser conglomeration of stuff that the glacier, the ice sheet, left behind. The rocks in this layer tend to be more angular, and to the extent that we see stone walls, mostly the stones are from this layer, right, that have come to the surface over time. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So over millions of years, we've got this 7 or 8 periods of glaciation and interglaciation, and the landscape gets transformed. The ice melts. First we get tundra, then we get coniferous forests, then we get deciduous forest and mixed forest. And so over this long period of time, we've got all of these natural forces: weather, water, animals, pressure, plants, really transforming the landscape. In upland areas, those natural processes produce what we might call sinking or settling stones. Without humans around, now imagine a time when there's not any humans in New England, right? Stones would naturally sort of sink down into the earth. Why would they do that? Well, all of the little creatures that we share this earth with, right? Little shrews and mice and voles and moles and spiders and beetles and millipedes, right? All those little creatures, as they're moving around in the soil, are leaving little areas where the rocks can sink into. As plants and trees die and their roots degrade or decompose, right? They've made space for those rocks to sink. So without humans around, stones would naturally sort of sink into the earth, and they'd be held there by root systems of trees and perennial plants, right? They wouldn't go anywhere, they'd just stay put. And that's what the landscape looked like for thousands of years after the Laurentide ice sheet melted. Until European settlers arrived. And what did European settlers do when they got here? Well, first they settled along the coasts, right? Both the southern coast areas of Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, but also the coastal areas of Maine. And when they got here, what did they do? They cleared land. They settled first along, of course, the coasts and rivers, right, because it was fertile soil, it was fresh water, they had access to the sea and rivers and water for transportation. But eventually, through the 1700s, mid-1700s, they moved sort of inland and upland. And as they did that, they kept clearing land, right? Why? They needed the wood, right, to build their homes, to build barns, right? They needed the wood, right, for fuel, right, to heat their homes, for cooking. So they cleared a lot of land. Susan Alport estimated that in sort of colonial times in northern New England, families used 30 to 40 cords of wood a year for heating and cooking. I cringe at the thought of having to move 3 cords of wood. 30 to 40 with no chainsaw, no power splitter, no thanks. So they cut lots and lots of wood. Tom Wessels, who is a naturalist and historian, estimates that by 1840, approximately 75% of the New England region's landscape had been converted to open land. So we were 75% deforested by about 1840. So lots of cutting of trees, right, deforesting the landscape, both for agriculture, right, crop production, livestock, pasture, etc. There's a lot we can tell about stone walls by the size and shape of them, the size and the shape of the stones in them, right? The surrounding land gives us clues to sort of what was going on there, helps us discern what the land was used for. And it's not news to you, I'm sure, that some stone walls involved a lot of time and expense and effort to build. They were meant to function, they were meant to last. And I want to show you a few pictures of walls like that. So this is a retaining wall that's made of huge granite blocks. This was obviously a labor-intensive process. That retaining wall is adjacent to this, which is a barn foundation, again made of huge granite blocks. So foundations, retaining walls, bridge abutments, right, were often made from stone. But you notice this is cut stone. Here's another use of cut stone or quarried stone. This is a cemetery in Raymond, where I live. It's called Riverside Cemetery. And this is one of my favorite places to walk. Let me just tell you a little bit about this wall, or the walls around this cemetery, so you can get an appreciation for sort of the labor and resources that this required. So what you're looking at is a wall that runs perpendicular to the road. It's about 800 feet long. One end is the road, the other end ends in a river. It can't go any further. The wall then extends 600 feet along the road, and then on the other side another 200 feet back, again until it almost comes to a river. Some of these blocks are 12 to 14 feet long. They're about 2 feet thick. I've forgotten exactly how wide they are, but I did a lot of measuring some years ago, measuring blocks and figuring things out and calculating the weight of granite and yada, yada, yada. Each of these blocks weighs in excess of 1,000 pounds. And there's some 1,600 feet of wall, right? This stone was quarried off of Rattlesnake Mountain, which is sort of across the street from the picture that you're seeing here. And it was built probably in the 1840s or 1850s by the Berry brothers, Gideon and John, who were quarrymen. They lived in town, and this is what they did. They also built my house. Those were the foundations you saw a few minutes ago. Here's some more of it. Cut or quarried stone was used when you wanted something to last, and you had resources, right, to invest in this thing, whether it's a foundation, right, or a cemetery wall, or a bridge abutment, or a dam, right, or an animal pound, etc. I included this picture just to show you and say a little bit about how quarried stone was worked. And you can see the line of little indents, right, on both of the courses of stone there. In the 18th century, stone would have been cut using a method called pin and feathering, in which, and what this means is the stone worker would drill holes into the stone, and those are the little indents that you see there, and then place in each one of those holes something that looked almost like a feather, two little pieces of iron that were kind of semicircular, and then drive a wedge down in between them, right, and keep driving it until the rocks split. Right? So quarried stone walls or cut stone walls, right, they're beautiful. They're amazing when you think about how much energy and resources were put into them. But that's really not what I want to focus on most of my attention tonight. I really want to focus on a different kind of stone wall, and that's what we might call a dry laid wall or a field stone wall. And this is an example of one at a farm near my house. It's not farmed anymore. But it's a laid wall or a dry laid wall. And it's made up of field stones. And you can see those big blocky stones. And if you were paying attention a few minutes ago, you can say, those probably came from the lodgement till, right? They were the big blocky ones that got tumbled around quite nicely, right? And they're pretty big. This was a very deliberately made wall. But it doesn't have any mortar. That's what's meant by dry laid. It's really just stones laid upon stones. This is another example of a laid wall, again, from that same farm. This is a laid wall that's probably 1 or 2 stones wide, and it's consistently about 2.5 or 3 feet high. It might have been a little bit higher when it was first made because as you can tell by all of the leaves in this picture, the leaves and the debris tend to accumulate around those walls and eventually break down and make soil, right? So the wall when it was originally built might have been a bit taller than 2.5 to 3 feet, but that's what it is. That's what it is about now. And if you think about the mechanics of the human body and lifting, right, a stone, you're not going to lift it way up here, right? You're going to lift it about to waist level or below, right? And so that's in part why the kind of optimal wall height, again, if you weren't using a lot of animal labor or levers or ramps, right, your walls are going to stay fairly low. You can't see it in this segment, but this one also has what's called a pass-through. It's about a 3-foot wide break in the wall that has cut stone on the edges. Right? So this was a really carefully made wall, and the cut stone edges in the pass-through suggest it was probably a boundary marker. It probably was marking the edges of somebody's property, and in fact, that's how it's used today. This is another dry laid wall, this one at a land trust property in Lovell. And some dry laid walls were intended as boundary markers. Some of them were really intended as fences, and sometimes people use the word stone fence. In the 18th and 19th century, fences were serious business. Particularly if in an agricultural society and agricultural communities, you had to keep your animals out of other people's crops. So you needed your fences to be good fences. And the height of fences was prescribed by law. They had to be 4 to 4.5 feet tall. And public officials enforced that so that you could get in a lot of trouble if your fences weren't up to snuff or your animals escaped and ruined somebody else's livelihood. Stone walls in and of themselves were probably not legal fences, because as I said a few moments ago, most of them weren't 4 to 4.5 feet tall. They were shorter than that. They probably would have looked something like this, but had wood fencing erected on top of it. So maybe sort of a crisscross with the stones running through the middle, and then bars up on top. So stone fences would have probably been a combination of stone and wood, only the wood has decomposed a long time ago. Only the stone is left. Not all walls were deliberately made to mark boundaries or to keep animals in or out. Some walls are what we call tossed walls. They were made just to get the stones out of the way, to get them out of the field. This is an example of a tossed wall. It looks pretty messy. I'm not sure how much you can really discern from the picture. I'll show you another one in just a moment. Well, let me bob ahead now. So a tossed wall is a lot messier. It wasn't made deliberately, stone by stone, carefully added and positioned. In fact, Robert Thorson, who studies stone walls, calls them linear landfills. They were places where, let me back up for a moment. A few minutes ago, I said that in a landscape without humans, rocks are going to sink. They're going to sink down into the earth, and they're going to get held there by the roots of trees and the roots of perennial plants. Once that landscape is deforested, different things happen. The process of thawing and freezing it actually starts to move rocks up to the surface. And so in a deforested landscape, instead of sinking stones, we get rising stones. And in New England, because remember, we're on glacial till, every year produced a new crop of stones. Right? And for farmers, particularly if they're cultivating the land for crops, those stones are a pain. They're not what you want where you want them. And any of you who have tried to garden in Maine probably know this, right? That every year I think I've cleaned my garden up really well, and every year there's more stones. They're still coming up. Right? Well, all things being equal, cultivating land, pasturing land is going to keep bringing stones up, and farmers need to figure out what to do with them. At one point in time, they would have used probably split rail fences or stumps to line the edges of their property. But as they keep getting stones, just throw them on the edge where the fences are. Right? So tossed walls like this are a lot messier. They serve the function of getting the stones out of the fields and out of the pastures. This particular one is actually about 7 or 8 feet wide at its base and about 5 feet wide up top. And on the bottom are some bigger stones, and then up top and in the middle are just like little ones that anybody could pick up like a softball size and just toss in there. You can see perhaps in this picture I'm really bad with left and right. On the left-hand side, the wall looks to be about 5 or 6 feet tall. And on this side, the right-hand side, which is sort of over the rocks there, it's only about 2 or 3 feet tall. And that actually gives us a clue as to how the land was used around this stone wall. The side that's shorter, or that seems shorter, it only appears shorter because the soil has been pushed up against the wall, right, over years of plowing the adjacent property or the adjacent land. So this particular stone wall, right, we can infer that on the right-hand side was a field for crops, and on the left-hand side was either a pasture or a woodlot. And I can't quite remember at this moment which one that was. Right? This is another example of stone wall building with stones as they lay. And it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but do you see that there's sort of a path through the trees here? Yeah, this is actually a cattle lane. This is from a different angle, and it makes it a little bit clearer. There are two stone walls running parallel to each other. They're about 8 or 10 feet apart, and it runs for hundreds of yards. And it was a cattle lane, right? A way of moving livestock from one pasture to another, keeping them out of crop fields. And it was built deliberately. I mean, the farmer had a plan, but it wasn't like it was carefully laid to last for forever, though it's still here 100 years later. But it was built with stones, again, as they were pulled out of the earth. And the farmer aimed to make sort of the most effective wall possible in the shortest amount of time with the least expense. You notice in this and several of the other pictures that there's woods all around these walls, right? And those are nice reminders that the areas where these walls are, even though they're now wooded, were once sort of cleared, cultivated land. Given the quantity of stone walls in New England, we might be tempted to think that, people spent hundreds of years building these things. And in fact, they were all, not all, but most of them were built in a relatively short period of time, roughly 50 years, between 1775 and 1825. That was the most intensive period of stone wall building in New England. As I said a moment ago, the earlier fences prior to 1775 probably would have been split rail or stumps along the sides of fields and pastures. But over time, with plenty of available labor and an ample supply of stone and a decreasing supply of wood, right, farmers increasingly used stone, right, to build those walls. There was some added incentive to build stone walls at the turn of the century, right around 1800 and the decades following, and that was related to sheep fever. In the early 1800s, for a variety of reasons, wool was very expensive and hard to come by. There was an embargo, there were high tariffs, and so there was a real incentive to produce wool for clothing locally. Fortuitously, a man named William Jarvis in 1809 imported some merino sheep from Spain. Spain had carefully guarded their merino sheep, which are known for their fleeces and for their really fine fiber that makes a really nice yarn and wool product. And the Spanish had really guarded their merino sheep. But in 1809, William Jarvis was able to persuade them to sell him a few, which he brought to Vermont. And in the coming years, what was called sheep fever took over. People were obsessed with raising sheep, increasing the size of flocks, right? Really a catalyst for, or a boom in sort of sheep farming and a catalyst for the textile industry. Sheep fever didn't last really long, maybe from 1810 to 1830, and then a few more busts and booms for another 40 years, and then another little bump from the Civil War. But while it was going on, farmers needed a way to keep those sheep contained in their fields, right? And so they did a lot of wall building. Again, often with wood on the top, right? But wall building to keep those sheep contained. In the mid-1800s, and especially after the Civil War, upland and inland farms in particular were abandoned in really large numbers. And there were a variety of things that contributed to that. All those sheep seriously overgrazed the pastures where they were, right? So there was overstocking and overgrazing that contributed to significant erosion, in some places sort of right down to the bedrock. So really wasn't good farming land anymore. The Homesteading Act in 1862 enticed people west. The railroads made it possible to move people west. The widespread use of barbed wire after 1874 made it a lot cheaper and easier to fence in big old flat land in the west as compared to hilly country in New England. So for all of those reasons, and the sort of ramping up of industrialization, right, lots of the upland hill farms in northern New England were abandoned starting in the 1860s. And rather than turning that land into something else, they just let it go back to forest and woods, which is why we find so many stone walls out in the middle of the woods, right? Because they weren't woods at the time that they were built. Susan Alport describes this as one of New England's really great ironies. And I'm just going to read a short passage from Susan Alport. She says, farmers had no sooner replaced their perishable wooden fences with stone ones than those very objects prevented them from adapting to new conditions created by the advent of farm machinery and large-scale farming practices. The marginal, largely self-subsistent farmers of New England no sooner had a home market and were gearing up to supply it than they lost most of that market to Western competition. So those stone walls that served farmers in New England so well for so long ultimately served to make sort of ramping up farming really difficult. If you've got a big old tractor, really hard to navigate a 1 to 3 acre field bounded by stone walls. So woods and forests reclaimed the land, and by 1900, more than half of New England's cleared land had gone back to forest. Right? So we're deforested, right? Gone back to forest. You with me so far? That was a lot of the natural history, some of the human history. Now we're going to shift our attention to sort of stonewall ecology. Sharp eyes, spot the little friend in this picture? Yeah. Stone walls, for those of you who haven't spotted it yet, there's a little chipmunk who was kind enough to peek out of the stone wall just as I was wandering by with my camera. Stone walls are fabulous animal habitat. Chipmunks, of course, use them for hideouts from predators and for lookouts. But chipmunks aren't the only animals that use stone walls. Lots of other animals, mice, gray squirrels, red squirrels, short-tailed weasels, minks, possums, skunks, raccoons, porcupines, all use stone walls for denning, for lookouts, for hideouts, for latrines. Field ecologists have discovered that small animal traffic, principally of reptiles and field mice, is actually higher on stone walls than in adjacent fields. And at the place where 2 or more stone walls meet, the traffic is even higher, right? So that small animals are often using stone walls, kind of like we use highways, I guess. I don't have a picture of it, but stone walls aren't just home for mammals, but also for reptiles and amphibians, and for invertebrates, the spiders and the beetles and the mites and the snails and all of that, those good little critters that are food for birds, for reptiles, for amphibians, and for mammals. Whole little food chain going on those stone walls. They're good places to eat. This was an acorn that was gnawed at, I think, by a mouse. So good place to perch and eat. Squirrels also like to perch on stone walls. There's no squirrel in this picture, but there are squirrel middens, which are these clumps of pine cones, the inside of pine cones, and the leftovers from squirrels eating the seeds out of pine cones. And some stone walls are really liberally blanketed with those kind of squirrel middens, especially in places where there's a lot of white pines around. I said a moment ago that animals use stone walls as latrines. Here would be proof of that. Weasels, fox, martens all like to do their business somewhere up high. So if not in the middle of a trail, on a stone wall is a good place too. And these are examples of that. Sometimes animals will use the base of stone walls as their latrines, so raccoons tend to do that. Stone walls, if we think about their natural ecology, also form little microclimates. This is a stone wall in Lovell, Maine. I can't remember when this was, January or February. It was after we got a snowstorm of about 16 inches of snow, and I think this was the day or 2 days afterward. And this is the northern exposure of the wall. And you might be scratching your head saying, what wall? Exactly my point. It's covered with snow. It's the northern exposure. It's completely covered. It's the hump there. And the northern exposure sort of stays covered with snow. In contrast, the southern exposure, the snow, because it's warmer with that southern exposure, the snow melts more quickly, right? Warms up more quickly. And that provides a nice little refuge in the middle of the winter, right, for animals who might want, right, both a hidey place, because you can get inside that stone wall, but also a warmer, drier place than the north side of the wall would offer them. Stone walls, not only during the winter, but in all times of year, stones tend to hold the heat, right? They hold the heat and cool off more slowly than the surrounding terrain. So animals like reptiles and amphibians that can't regulate their body heat find that kind of attractive. So stone walls provide microclimates and are an integral part of a forest ecosystem. They also can be nice in the spring by providing extra warm places for daffodils. I confess, this is a cheater picture. It's not from Maine, it's from Scotland. But I put it in here because it shows a stone wall in Scotland that is just blanketed with gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous moss. When I saw that wall, I had to go up to it and massage the moss and put my arm in. The moss went up to my elbow. It was that thick. It was spectacular. As an aside, somebody who saw this presentation or something like it recorded emailed me a couple of years ago, a person from Seattle, and he said, I know that wall. I built that wall, which I just thought, that's kind of cool. So I'm leaving that picture in, partly because it illustrates the beauty of the moss, and partly because it kind of illustrates the beauty of the internet. But anyway, the moss is really fabulous. It's not just moss that likes to live on walls. Probably the most conspicuous organism that lives on walls are lichens, even though I think many people don't notice lichens at all. Some of them, like the rock shield lichen, the xanthoparmelia in the upper right and the bottom left, live on the rock itself. They attach themselves to the rock. You can't get it off the rock. That's its substrate. That's where they live. But other kinds of lichens, like the powderhorn and the trumpet lichen on the bottom, or the little, again, the powderhorn, or the pixie cup, which is the bigger picture. Y'all see those little pixie cups? Those lichens are actually living not on the rock itself or the stones themselves. They're living on little pockets and piles of debris that gather in the nooks and crannies and little depressions and rough spots on rocks. So that the stone walls, right, are places where pine needles fall, leaves fall. Eventually, all of that turns into humus, to soil, to good places for lichens and ferns and wildflowers and grasses and trees, right, to take root and flourish. And you can imagine, I suspect, if you think about a long time period, that tree roots growing in stone walls over time topple stones, dislodge the stones, right, cause the walls to maybe fall apart. Sometimes it's trees growing up in them. Sometimes it's trees falling over on them that dislodge stone walls. Stone walls change for all kinds of reasons related to sort of natural processes. But humans have played a role too. This is that cemetery right near my house again. And in this particular picture, you can see that a couple of big blocks of granite have been moved over. They're now on the right-hand side of the wall. This was the local snowmobile club who wanted a clean shot through the wall, right, rather than having to go up and over it in the winter. So humans have, dismantled walls or moved pieces of them around. Here's another example. The land is for sale, and so is the rock wall. Landscapers are often buy rocks, right, from rock walls for repurposing them for landscaping. Or sometimes rock walls, stone walls get bulldozed, right, for subdivision or, I don't know, any kind of new building. But before we get too upset about that, that's been happening for 150 years. Back in the 1850s, when the rock crusher was invented, right, people routinely used stones from stone walls, right, in rock crushers to build the roads we drive on. Right? So human activity disrupting stone walls isn't exactly a new thing. Luckily, there are also people who are interested in protecting and preserving or conserving or learning about stone walls. This looks like a picture of nothing. It's not nothing. It's looking from above at a piece of forested land. And so what we're looking at is a tree canopy, a forested landscape. But people like Katherine Johnson, who studied at UConn, have started using LIDAR. And LIDAR is a kind of, it stands for light detection and ranging. I got to read this to make sure I get it right. It's a remote sensing method that uses light in the form of a pulsed laser to measure ranges or variable distances to the Earth. And one of the beautiful things that LIDAR can do is show you what's under the canopy that you can't see from the air or from being on the ground right with it. So this is also from Katherine Johnson's work. And LIDAR has enabled her to locate in completely forested, densely forested areas where the stone walls are, right? Where house foundations used to be, for example, where old roads used to be. Right? And she's doing this as part of a project to learn more about stone walls and to offer information and resources to people who want to conserve those stone walls. Probably the most famous, well-known conservation project, I guess I should say, is by Robert Thorson at the University of Connecticut. He has put together the Stonewall Initiative. This is just a screenshot from their website. And the Stonewall Initiative is devoted to sort of appreciating, conserving, educating about stone walls. And they're a fabulous, fabulous source of information. So I'm running on too long because I want to leave you all time for questions, so I'll stop there. But by closing, just two things. First is that stone walls, even though they seem pretty permanent and durable, always changing, right? Changing by way of natural forces, weather, trees, plants, animals, blowdowns, changing with our activity. And we can choose to sort of destroy them, repurpose them for landscaping, or we might choose to learn about and conserve them. And finally, I just want to point out, I've put a couple of books in the back of the room that were tremendous resources for me if you want to just take a browse through them. And I've put a list of various references and resources in case you felt inclined to go explore some more. So let me stop there and take questions or comments? Let's look at something prettier while we're talking. There we go. Let's look at that. No, wait. We got to look at something from Maine. There. We got winter coming. We'll get in the mood. Questions?
Are there particular species of lichens and mosses that do well on stone walls? And does it depend on what the stones are, what kind of mineral they are?
Let me repeat the question because that was what I was directed to do by your tech person. So are there particular species of lichens that live on stone walls, and does it matter what the stone is? And the answer to both of those is yes. Lichens live on different kinds of substrates. So there are some lichens that will never live on a rock or a stone, and there are some that only live on stones. So there's that. And then, yes, there are various different kinds of lichens that prefer different kinds of stones. And I can't give you the specifics off the top of my head because there are hundreds of thousands of kinds of lichens, many of which we can't distinguish without chemical tests. But yes, you are right that there's some only live on stone, and some like some kinds of stone better than others. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know the history of the rock walls on Route 88 and Falmouth Forsyth and Cumberland Forsyth?
Okay, so the question is, do I know the history of the stone walls along Route 88 in Falmouth Forsyth and Cumberland Forsyth? And the answer is no. I don't know Cumberland very well. I do know that lots of historical societies have sort of information about how the land was used around where walls are that you can sort of do some digging. If I were to walk them, or if other naturalists were to walk them, sometimes just the landscape itself around it would give us some clues. But I'm afraid I don't know that particular stone wall.
Does anybody in the audience know
Other questions or comments? I see a couple of hands. Go ahead.
How were the rocks built and how were the rocks moved throughout the field?
How were the rocks?
How were the walls built and how were the rocks moved through the wall?
Again, a variety of ways. If they were larger rocks, they probably would have been put on stone sleds and pulled by oxen, right, across the field. Smaller rocks could have been moved by hand. There's a stone wall builder named Kevin Gardner, who's out of Hopkinton, New Hampshire. He's got a really lovely talk on YouTube that you could Google and find. And he talks about, he's very interested in sort of just the mechanics, which sounds to me like you're asking questions about the mechanics of it. And his presentation is really fabulous because that's exactly what he gets into. He's a stone wall builder. He's essentially, with the right tools, right? A lever, a ramp, right? A pulley, an iron bar that you can use to roll something with. You can move a rock of pretty much any size. So I'm going to leave Kevin Gardner to it, and you can find him easily online. He's a lot more humorous than I am, and he doesn't talk behind a podium. He talks at a table and builds a wall with little stones while he talks. So it's well worth watching. Yeah. I think there was another hand over there somewhere. Go ahead.
There's a stone wall I came upon in back of Knight's Ponds near here.
Mm-hmm.
It goes on for a few hundred yards probably.
Mm-hmm.
And the stones are pretty big and balanced, and there's a lot of spaces, a lot of parts of the wall, there's as much open space as stone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that unusual? It seems like it would be really difficult if it was built that way to balance them instead of having them stacked.
Yeah, so the question is about a stone wall at Knight's Pond and lots of open space in the wall. And yes, that does sound difficult.
Rocks were taken. It looks like it was made that way.
Yeah, yeah. There's a book that I'm thinking of by Hubble, and it's about sort of different types of stone walls. And there is actually this type of stone wall called a lacy wall, where spaces are deliberately left in it. I can't say that I have come across any of those in Maine that I can think of. And I've been to Knight's Pond, but not for a really long time. I don't recall seeing that.
Afterwards.
Yeah. There are stone walls that were built that way deliberately. I don't know why. I mean, I guess I would imagine it would be a more decorative sort of wall, sort of showing off your property boundaries, perhaps. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Are there people that are specialized in repairing rock walls?
Yes.
A lot of them?
Well, Kevin Gardner is one of them. Again, that's not my specialty. It doesn't come cheap. It's a laborious process, and it's not a process or a skill that many people have anymore. I mean, by necessity, people in the 18th and 19th century had to build stone walls. Later in the 19th century, with waves of immigrants, particularly from Ireland, Germany, and other places, Italy, we had sort of then professional stone wall builders coming to this country. And so a lot of the kind of stonework that we see in public buildings, public places, right, were from immigrants who brought stone building skills with them. Yeah, and now I'm not sure, not so many people have those skills anymore. There are still people around, though, who will build and repair stone walls. Sure. Well, even people just around here. I mean, Kevin Gardner's a good example. His uncle was a stone wall builder, and he learned the craft from his uncle, and that's his business and his life's work. And some of the walls and repairs are gorgeous, spectacular, that he's built. Yeah.
How about stones for chimneys and things like that? I've seen some that are dry laid and done very, very
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Each stone has a particular spot.
Yeah, again, not something I've studied, but certainly another use of stone. And again, absent other alternatives in the 18th and 19th century, yeah, that's what you use.
When you talked about the different stone walls, I'm wondering if it's like other craftsmen, do they have their own special way of doing the walls? So if you looked at a wall, you'd say, oh yes, that's
That's a good question. Do different stonewall craftsmen sort of have their own technique? And I'm fairly certain that some do. I don't know enough about the different craftsmen and their styles to know, but I would imagine so. Why not?
You have to have an eye for it.
Sure, with enough training and experience, yeah, and knowing an eye for it, absolutely, yeah.
Are you familiar with the Cribstone Bridge?
Am I familiar with the Cribstone Bridge? Yes, I am. If I go to my parents' house and look out the window, it's right there. But I don't know anything about how it was built.
That was the next question.
I don't know anything about how it was built. I might have read up on it at one point, but it's gone. It hasn't lodged itself in my memory. It's on Bailey Island. Yeah.
You also spoke earlier about cutting stone, and I've seen a lot of stone where it has the drill holes. I recently tried to break a stone, a piece of granite. I used a masonry bit, and it didn't work very quite well. So I ended up cutting it with a diamond saw blade. That worked very well. I don't think they had diamond bits and things like that. So how do they drill?
How do they drill through stone when masonry bits and diamond bits seem to have a hard time of it?
Yeah.
I don't know. This is where I need to sort of, I think, revisit places like Sturbridge Village, for example, where they recreate and can demonstrate some of those old techniques.
You have to give us the name of the gentleman that does know about that so that we can hire him to take it on.
I don't know anybody who cuts stone, but yeah, I'm sure the internet could tell us. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Sure, go ahead.
Would some types of stone split more easily than others?
The question is, would some types of stone split more easily than others? And the answer is yes, absolutely. A lot of what we find in Maine and northern New England is granite, which is a really hard stone. But stones are graded on their hardness. They vary. Some stones are pretty soft. You could scratch them even with your fingernail. On others, not so much. And so there are other kinds of stone, shale, for example, that splits and shatters really easily. Sandstone that would cut much more easily. Granite, a lot harder to cut and sculpt. Yeah. And of course, in other parts of New England, where sandstone or other kinds of stone besides granite are more common, the stone walls are made out of other kinds of stone. I mean, we're probably most familiar with, those big old blocky things that because of our glacial till. Sure.
So, do you know anything about, if you look about when the continents used to be together, it shows the Appalachian Mountains were connected at some point to the mountains in Scotland. Does that mean they're made of the same stone?
So the question is about, you didn't say this, but essentially plate tectonics, right? How do continents sort of come together and go apart again? And it is the case that, and I think this is partly why sort of Scotland so resonates with me, because their landscape really is, in some respects, very similar to our landscape, right? And the landforms and the mountains. And so yes, it is very similar in terms of the rock. And England has a lot of rocks too. I mean, again, because we used to be part of the same continent. They don't have as many stone walls as we do, though. And I actually looked this up this morning. I think the stone in England, a recent, I wrote it down, 2007 report found that England has between 49 and 69,000 miles of stone walls compared to our 246,000. So not quite so many stone walls there. But in lower lying areas in England, Ireland as well, hedgerows, right, which may or may not be combined with stone walls. Yeah. Other questions, comments? I think we're kind of at an end time. I don't want to keep you all night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was
Very
lovely.
interesting.
Thank you.